Well, joining us for the programme, we have Theresa Pearce, Labour MP for Erith and Thamesmead, and Paul Burstow, Liberal Democrat MP for Sutton and Cheam. Very warm welcome to you both. Thanks for being with us. First of all, let's talk about this story. Of course, it's dominated all news agendas and will continue to do so. The death of Margaret Thatcher. We've heard some fulsome praise. We've also heard some dissenting voices too. I'd like to, though, look at the way some of her ideas and policies might have played out in the capital if she was still here. And I'm particularly interested in the multicultural aspect of the city, because we have also with us Mike Freer, who is the man who represents, well, in part at least, Lady Thatcher's constituency. It's Finchley as part of yours, Finchley and Golders Green. And it's Bob Carr's comments in Australia, the Australian Foreign Minister. He said a few days ago that he thought, and the words were very strong, he thought that Margaret Thatcher was racist. Now, did that make any sense to you?
Totally wrong, totally wrong. Actually, if you look at Mrs Thatcher's record in Finchley, she was the first that I know of who represented and embraced the Jewish community. She also, from an early stage, founded an Anglo-Indian association. So from a very early stage in her career, she was by no means racist. She completely embraced anybody from their background. She wasn't bothered about people's backgrounds. It's what they had to offer that drove her forward.
So when he spoke of her warning that Sydney should not be allowed to become like Fiji, that you mustn't have minority communities taking over, that is not the person that you recognise?
No, I think it's always difficult to take things that were said many years ago and apply them today. What's important, I think, what she was trying to say is that she fought very hard for integration, and there's a big difference between communities being isolated in a city or being fully integrated, and that's probably what she was trying to warn against. She was very keen on integration, which is a very different message.
At the moment, we're sort of wrestling between sort of myth and hagiography and hatred. We're somewhere in the middle trying to find out what this woman was really like. Was she inclusive? Was she? I mean, you're a man who is out and gay and proud, and yet there was a leader who brought in Clause 28, let's not forget. So, I mean, how do you reconcile that yourself?
I personally think she was probably badly advised. I was never, one of the inner circle, so I want to put that. I was never, a close confidant of Mrs Thatcher. But my take on her and the Conservative Party is she really didn't care. She took a very libertarian view to sexuality. She didn't care what people did in the privacy of their homes. The whole issue on Section 28, I think she was badly advised. And also looking back over, it was 40, 30 years ago, things were very different. And I can't explain it, but I know personally she had no hang-ups about people's sexuality.
Well, I know, you've got one personal anecdote which I'd really love to come to if we get a chance, but let's just talk to both of you as well. If she walked through the London that we have today, Theresa, would she have been a happy Prime Minister, do you think?
Well, she lived in London right up to the end of her days, so clearly she knew what London was like and how it had changed. I'd be very interested to see what she would make of London now. I'd particularly be interested to see how she'd get on with the Mayor of London.
Well, that's a really good point, because
the Battle of the Blondes.
Yes, I mean we've been the Battle of the Blondes is a lovely way of putting it. I mean, sort of looking through the enormous amount of history that's shining out. She was not a lady who liked to share a stage, Paul Burstow, and yet we have a mayor who also, one could argue, doesn't like to share a stage. How would that
And when she was
along?
Prime Minister, of course, she looked across the Thames to the headquarters of the GLC and said it must go, and swept away democratic government for London for over a decade. And whilst there were obviously people who never supported Ken Livingstone, I certainly didn't, and didn't like many of his policies, the idea that you get rid of your opponents by abolishing them was not really an act of a democratic leader, and certainly was not good for London in terms of actually having democratic accountability and coordination of important services in London.
So there is an argument that, some say she was a great friend of London, but Mike Freer, others say, bits of it, but not the whole of the city. She liked, the square mile, but the rest of it she could have perhaps taken or left.
Well, again, I think that's wrong. I mean, it's important to remember she represented suburban London. She was a London MP. She was very proud of London being a world city and wanted London to retain that crown.
So how do you feel when you see bits of London, Brixton, for example, on the day of the announcement of her death, street parties going on. We hear again during the funeral there are parts of the city which may again do the same thing. Just first of all, what's your feeling about that?
Well, I think it's. I was always brought up. You have your differences in life. but when someone passes, you put those differences to one side. If you want to argue about her legacy, you do that after the funeral and not during the period of official mourning. I think that's distasteful, and people should know better. If they want to have a street party, if they want to argue the case, they should do that after the funeral. But to do it now, I think, is childish and actually says more about them than it does about Mrs Thatcher's legacy.
I did mention that you have a lovely anecdote. You do your surgery even now behind bomb-proof glass,
Yes.
and that's a throwback to her time, where she held surgery every week, even when she was Prime Minister. Is that right?
Well, her surgeries were every 3 weeks, sometimes more frequently, but at least every 3 weeks. And it doesn't matter what was going on. In the middle of the Falklands conflict, her surgeries carried on. And during the main threats from the IRA, we had a mortar attack on the office. We had bomb-proof glass, which is a remnant of her time. And for a period of time, she wasn't allowed to have her surgery in the office, and she had to have it in local buildings and houses so that she wasn't a sitting target.
It's an
People forget
absolutely,
that.
yeah, it's a fascinating insight. Thank you very much indeed. It is